Not only did it stop a lot of the military operations here, but it also stopped our equipment from working. I want to show you some video that was shot just before the sandstorm really kicked off. You'll see that really red sky, something about how the sand diffuses the light. Very, as one soldier put it, it's like the calm before the storm, very eerie. Now, that sandstorm, like I said, that followed was really pretty devastating. It grounded the entire helicopter fleet of the 101st Airborne, which meant that that pretty much paralyzed all their helicopter operations. It also disoriented a lot of the soldiers, and not only just U.S. soldiers on the ground. At least according to the U.S. military, 6 Iraqis inadvertently drove up to the base, got lost, and drove right up to this base. They were picked up, spotted by a group of U.S. soldiers right outside the base. Those U.S. soldiers surrounded the SUV that those Iraqis were traveling in, and the Iraqis, seeing that they were surrounded, surrendered to them. Now, they were then taken into custody. The U.S. military, you were talking about the Fedayeen with Marty just a second ago. The U.S. military says these 6 men belong to the Fedayeen, and the U.S. military is calling the Fedayeen, they call it Saddam Fedayeen, a paramilitary group that is very loyal to the Iraqi leader, to President Saddam Hussein. They say these 6 men were couriers carrying money. They found a lot of money. In fact, they found a lot of U.S. currency inside that SUV, and messages to Ba'ath Party leaders in nearby towns. So pretty interesting. Now, I had a chance to both see the Iraqis and also speak with one of the soldiers that was guarding the Iraqis, and I asked him how he would compare how the Iraqis that they were holding were being treated with how he thought American POWs being held here inside Iraq are being treated. Here's what he had to say, Jim.
I think that regardless of what they do, you know, we're not them, and just because, you know, somebody else does that, you know, golden rule, you know, do unto others as you had done unto them. And I think it also makes our resolve to fight stronger because we don't want to get captured, but it makes their resolve to fight less because they know if they get captured, they're going to get treated humanely, they're going to get fed, they're going to get blankets, they're going to get shelter, medical treatment.
A quick footnote to that video, when I was there, I did see that one of the 6 Iraqis did get some medical attention from a doctor that was on hand. He treated him with some medicine for asthma. I also saw that the Iraqis got some blankets from the U.S. soldiers, though they came a little bit later. And lastly, the soldier that you just heard from, he also said that they were going to set up a tent to try and house the Iraqis. Quite frankly, the 101st got caught a little bit off guard. This base just got set up about 4 days ago, and while they were expecting to capture Iraqi soldiers or to have Iraqi soldiers surrender, they weren't expecting it quite this quickly. So that camp really wasn't set up, and they weren't really quite prepared. So they were doing some quick thinking on their feet there. Jim?
The fighting continues around Najaf. The 1st Battalion of the 41st Field Artillery still engaged in what's being described as the biggest battle of the war so far. But then disaster. A shell misfires. The vehicle, a state-of-the-art Paladin, explodes. There's confusion as the flames engulf the howitzer. But amazingly, the crew escapes with little more than light burns and torn battle dress. Further south, just a few miles outside Basra, a stream of Iraqi civilians pour out of the city in search of water and shelter from air raids. Fleeing Iraqi militias within the city and wary of coalition forces outside, they're watched over by soldiers and tanks from the 7th Armoured Brigade, the Desert Rats. Basra itself remains in Iraqi hands. But earlier, the Desert Rats had been involved in their biggest tank battle since the Second World War.
In Basra, we've come up against some stiff opposition from a mixture of regime paramilitaries and the remnants of the Iraqi Army's 51st Division, who we believe have been coerced by the regime to reoccupy their equipment.
Coalition troops now control most of the desert outside Basra. Royal Marines from 40 Commando seen here moving up the Four Peninsula. In Baghdad today, the sandstorm has cleared. It's meant to return to the burning of oil trenches and Allied bombing. By the roadside, militias receive last-minute weapons training. Some need it more than others, as the prospect of a street battle looms. There are serious fighters here, and some American advisors are predicting the war could last months.
It hasn't happened yet. But the British Army believe they will soon crush Saddam Hussein's regime here in southern Iraq. Their aim is to get humanitarian aid to the people of Basra in particular, a population of more than 1 million with little clean water and facing the threat of disease. But to bring in aid, first the British say they must topple the ruling Ba'ath Party leadership. And so, in the half-light of daybreak, an assault is launched against one of its headquarters.
If you see anything move in front of these railway tracks, let it have it.
The Desert Rats of 7th Armoured Brigade advance through the mud near Azabaya. They're taking no chances. Almost 30 tanks and 200 troops against a single compound where fighters loyal to Saddam are said to be holding out.
The aim of this operation was to try and take out the leadership. And so if the brain of the operation is gone, I hope that the other parts of it may crumble.
Today we joined British troops patrolling on the road close to Basra. No wonder they watch everything that moves. Some of their fellow soldiers have already been killed or captured very close to here. The men of the Duke of Wellington's regiment set up roadblocks, checking every passing car, trying to stop Saddam's fighters moving around, suspicious even of those who carry the white flag. The British are using roadblocks like this one to show that they are in control of the roads around Basra here in southern Iraq. But they're also searching for weapons, which they believe are being secretly transported from one town to another by fighters loyal to Saddam Hussein. Ben Brown, BBC News, southern Iraq.
I've been embedded, have been in battle, 72 hours of constant fire, ambushes on both sides of the road, machine gun bullets dinging off the tanks. These soldiers are exceptionally well trained. They have one goal, and that's going back to the United States, but they know the road leads through Baghdad, and that's why they're fighting north. They're very eager to get this over with.
Continues around Nasaria for a 5th straight day. US aircraft have been bombing Iraqi positions in and around Nasaria all day, in some cases using heavy artillery. They've been billowing clouds of smoke rising from points across the town. This follows a surprise overnight Iraqi rocket attack on US Marine positions just to the south of the town. More than 30 Marines were injured in that attack, including at least some in what appears to have been some kind of friendly fire incident when Marines mistakenly fired on their own side. Whatever the case, Nasaria continues to prove a thorn in the side of the US military.
For Basra, British troops are still outside the city, still unwilling to engage in all-out urban warfare there. But what happened today was an indication of the balance of power here. The Challenger tanks of the 7th Armoured Brigade outgun and outmaneuver the elderly Russian T-55 tanks used by the Iraqis. They're a generation apart, and the Challenger enjoys a vast technological advantage. British commanders simply cannot understand then why a column of Iraqi tanks should suddenly have decided to take them on. It was a suicidal move which ended in disaster. The fighting began when the 14 Iraqi tanks tried to flee Basra by heading south to the Al-Four Peninsula. They were confronted by 14 British Challengers. Fierce fighting broke out, and all the Iraqi tanks, along with 4 armoured personnel carriers, were destroyed. Civilians were fleeing Basra in large numbers today, fearful that they could be trapped if a battle erupts. British tanks are now ranged in force outside the city, but have so far made no attempt to go in. In the countryside south of Basra, meanwhile, British troops have mounted roadblocks to search for firearms. Discarded weapons were today being blown up beside the road. Many of Saddam's fighters here are still defiant, but it appears they're facing overwhelming odds.
For many hours, the evening silence had been punctuated by fierce firefights as the Marines tried to push forward, constantly harassed by Iraqi guerrilla fire. The Iraqis were an irritant, but doing little damage. It took the Marines themselves to do this. Mistakes are inevitable in any war, particularly one as confusing as this one. But even so, this was a bad one.
It was late last night when a small group of Iraqis attacked this position from the west over here. Immediately the defenders called for help, and racing down from the north came Marine armoured vehicles. Unfortunately, they, rather than engaging the Iraqis, engaged their own men, and this is the result. 30 wounded, miraculously none killed. 15 of those wounded were from a small unit we've been travelling with ever since this war began. We knew them well. For us, at least, this war has suddenly become very personal.
The only consolation for those who escaped unhurt was that no one had died.
You can see all the rounds coming in the cab and stuff like that.
How lucky do you feel to be standing here?
Pretty lucky. It was a pretty heavy firefight last night.
There's trucks on fire, then I heard a big boom, and I go in the back of the tent, and I look on the side of the tent again. The whole side of the tent just gone and exploded, and first instinct to get up and get out of there. I don't even remember getting dressed like I did and take cover, and we're very lucky. I mean, to have no one killed out here. Very, very lucky.
Stuff like that, it's a possibility out here. But we're gonna move on.
For the first time this morning, large numbers of refugees have begun to stream out of the city of Nasaria, heading south to nowhere in particular except away from the war. The US forces have neither food nor shelter for them. They can provide only the most rudimentary medical care and then send them on their way. It is one of the biggest fears of commanders here that this trickle should turn into a flood of people for whom they can do nothing. Morale among the troops has undoubtedly been hit by what happened here last night. One quite senior officer said to me today, "This war stinks. I'm sick of it already." Just one voice, but perhaps an ominous one.
Tanks and warrior armoured vehicles of the 7th Armoured Division are spearheading the attack on Basra, but it is proving a lengthy business, resistance stronger than anticipated, and every day more civilians are killed and maimed. As soon as it's deemed safe, those armoured vehicles are bringing in aid to try and win over people here. This was Al-Samawa, southwest of Basra, yesterday. The clamour for food parcels, eloquent commentary on the poverty Saddam Hussein and sanctions have ground into the Iraqi people.
Have you got troops forward at this position? No. Andy!
Earlier, British tanks and US jets had obliterated what they said was the Ba'ath Party headquarters in Al-Samawa.
They have a mixture of weapons, generally RPGs and AK-47 rifles, but sometimes mortars, and they operate in small bands, generally trying to ambush convoys as they move around the town.
Moving up the Basra road this morning, the British Army's mission to gain intelligence and to try to begin winning hearts and minds is underway. To the south, Safwan, still under Ba'ath Party control and not fully secure. Azubaya is just north of here, the scene of fighting for several days.
Just keep down. Okay. Wait for your clear, please. You got it?
At the roadside and in vehicles, Iraqi munitions are discovered, seized and blown up.
In terms of weaponry, there was a find some 800 metres up this main road, 300 mortar rounds, some RPG rounds, quite a considerable find. Obviously represents a threat.
The British say they've come to win hearts and minds, but the locals are terrified of being shot by them, many still carrying white flags as some kind of protection. Every vehicle flagged down, the occupants questioned by an interpreter, and then the vehicle searched.
It has to be questioned how far an alien invading army who don't speak your language, point guns at you, stop your car and ask you questions goes in terms of winning over your heart or your mind.
This man said he and his people were just farmers and were fed up with war.
Reaffirming what everyone else has said, that the Iraqi people are concerned about water and food and lack of assistance, really.
Of course, this was a tightly controlled photo opportunity, but the control was as much about ensuring our security here as trying to manage the message. The fact that it's still unsafe on day 8 of the invasion says much about just how many Iraqi hearts and how many Iraqi minds have still to be won.
The message is to show our audience the truth, even it is dirty war. We are in Al Jazeera not a part of a coalition nor a part of the Iraqi regime. We are independent media. Thank you.
That was your statement, was it, or was there a question there? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. Did you ask a question?
I have no question.
You have no question. Let me just say in response that I know that Al Jazeera's management wants to produce a station which they can be proud of. They want to produce a station that engages in balanced reporting. That type of reporting is neither balanced, nor should anybody take any pride in it. Take it from me.
73rd Airborne in the sky above northern Iraq. Just a few moments, the first of about 1,000 U.S. paratroopers, including 100 on this U.S. Air Force C-17, begin jumping into the darkness. Once they hit the ground, they will secure an airfield and begin preparing for the arrival of the big guns, namely Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles. They'll be flown in and should begin arriving sometime in the next week. As for the paratroopers, they arrive in Iraq just 30 seconds after they step out the door. Here's how the jump works in each of the 10 planes on tonight's mission. The C-17 drops to about 1,200 feet, and 2 doors are opened on opposite sides of the plane. 50 jumpers exit each side, all in less than 1 minute. The plane is nearly empty. By now, the paratroopers have landed on the ground, loaded their weapons, and disconnected from their parachutes. The dangers of falling through the night sky have passed for this mission, but a new set of threats awaits them on solid ground. Thomas Nigel, CNN reporting from the sky above northern Iraq.
Control of Basra's international airport. There are also unconfirmed reports that they've taken over the city's TV and radio station. And as the forces make steady advances towards Basra, they're being passed by a steady stream of thousands of Iraqis trudging out of the city, escaping the shelling, looking for food and water.
Firing north at the Iraqi army, warning them to come no closer. And firing west, right over to the far side of Basra, ramming home the message that the city is completely contained. The Iraqi soldiers manning these positions got the message, but some of their comrades are fighting on. This Iraqi trench on the perimeter of Basra airport has clearly been abandoned for some time, but just 5 miles over there in the city centre itself, elements of the Iraqi army and the irregular Fedayeen still appear to hold control. The artillery have bombarded them so much they've pretty much run out of targets, and yet the 7th Armoured Brigade still sit on the outskirts of the city and wait.
We need some patience. We need some patience, and for the few people that were here 12 or 13 years ago, it was all very fast. There was no waiting around. We had a 3-day rush, and now this sort of slightly more reminiscent of the fighting that perhaps our fathers and our grandfathers spoke about from the Second War, where there were long periods of nothing, and then maybe a few very short periods of great excitement and perhaps fear.
But waiting has its upside too. And today, the first post arrived since war began.
Even though it is out of date, it's not out of date for us, if you know what I mean. It's nice to know, for instance, just little things like my little baby who's a year old, she's now doing big sloppy kisses that are really disgusting. It's just quite funny just to have news like that. She'll completely change by the time we get home probably, so that's good. Yeah, nice.
But this won't last long. Latest intelligence reports suggest the 2 Iraqi divisions north of Basra might be about to move south. If that's the case, rest days like this will come few and far between. Catherine Jones, Southern Iraq, 5 News.
9 o'clock this morning, firing broke out on this road about half a mile away. An intense skirmish followed. It was just one incident, but rather typical of the way this war is developing.
Let's get going. Let's get mounted up and get on out of here.
Bravo Company 269 Armour headed towards the city of Al-Samawa. In the distance, fires were burning, and beneath the sound of the tank tracks, we could hear heavy exchanges of fire. As the unit entered the city, a vehicle was burning. And beside the road, an abandoned car with bullet holes. Other vehicles had clearly been hit. The tanks began firing at Iraqi positions. About 1,000 Fedayeen, Saddam's militia, were thought to be in the city. They returned fire, but for them this is now a hit-and-run war, determined to disrupt American convoys using the nearby highway. At the rail yard, American forces destroyed a tank and some pieces of artillery. Some Iraqis were on the streets. Most stayed behind the walls of their houses. And when people tried to leave this factory, 2 rounds were fired to keep them inside. The Iraqis were pushed back, but not defeated. Neither was the city taken. Later we saw airborne troops being flown towards Baghdad, and that remained the priority for the Americans, taking the capital first. The company returned here to the edge of the city. What we're not hearing from in all of this is ordinary Iraqi people, and what they make of the war intended to liberate them. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Al-Samawa.
In the half-light of the early morning, through an enveloping mist, we followed British soldiers threading their way through an Iraqi village. They're clearing a route for the tanks to come in behind. The target, a compound near the village of Al-Samawa, south of Basra. Holed up here Ba'ath Party militants loyal to Saddam Hussein, whom the British Army believes have been coercing local civilians to fight against the coalition forces. With access to rocket-propelled grenades, mortars and AK-47s, they've been tying up British Army resources for days. American bombers dropped a series of 1,000-pound bombs on the compound, but missed the main target. Then the big guns rolled in. 7 Challenger 2 tanks and 10 warriors to finish it off.
We found the compound. The compound was entered by the tanks, and we were able to look around the compound, see what else was there, and withdraw successfully, actually picking up an enemy wounded casualty on the way out and treating him, and then withdrawing successfully.
No other enemy was sighted, but local villagers later said around 20 to 30 militiamen remained. This information coming from grateful villagers as they received their first coalition humanitarian aid. Immediately after the battle for Al-Samawa, the battle for hearts and minds has begun. The nest of Iraqi fighters holed up near this village had proved a thorn in the side of British forces for some time. It's hoped that this operation will now clear the way for the main concentrated attack on Basra itself. Diana Muriel, CNN, Al-Samawa, southern Iraq.
Armed and on the lookout. This US reconnaissance patrol is combing the desert for hiding spots that could be used by Iraqi guerrilla squads. Dozens of Apache attack helicopters are parked nearby, many damaged in combat with Iraqi Republican Guard units north of here earlier this week. Repairs are underway. As a key part of the US strike force, these choppers may be prime targets for Iraqi units. US soldiers believe there's a risk of attack by Iraqi Fedayeen guerrilla units. Marauders were spotted close by last night.
What'd you guys hear about today? Just possible attack tonight?
Yeah. Weapons drawn, extreme caution. Just outside the perimeter of the makeshift US airbase sits this mud brick house. US soldiers say it could serve as an Iraqi observation post. Other huts and farmhouses are noted nearby. Ideal spots to launch hit-and-run strikes.
A lot of cover and concealment, and a lot of positions for them to set up in direct fire assets such as mortars, light artillery.
Security is being beefed up. Infantry soldiers and tanks are rolling in.
This dusty desert airfield just south of the US forces' front lines is one of several main staging posts for American troops. It will be one of the launch pads for an assault on Baghdad, but surrounded by flat open desert, it's also a potential target for Iraqi forces.
Based on where we're at right now, anticipate seeing small 12-man squads moving out through the desert on foot.
Sergeant Moody's betting his colleagues a cold case of beer they'll see an